the 14th Amendment and a provision that prevents somebody who has been involved in actual insurrection from being on the ballot. Now, why do you need that? Well, in the mindset of people who had faced the near destruction of the Republic over an insurrection, it is not impossible to imagine a highly popular insurrectionist. And so this provision is placed in the Constitution as a protection against a scenario that is not unimaginable. Mm-hmm. Mapping this scenario onto Donald Trump is a terrifying abuse of logic. But it's an abuse of logic for reasons that one cannot establish in absolute terms. Donald Trump was president. The folks who thought that was a asteroid headed for Earth were wrong. Okay? You can say a lot of things about Trump. I wish, and in fact, maybe I'm just going to break the habit of always saying, this isn't my guy, I didn't vote for him, I don't want him to be president, I don't think he has the characteristics that make a good president. But he did a lot of good stuff. And top of the list, I would point out, and I'm going to come back to this, is no new wars. Now, no new wars is something that virtually every American should be biased towards. There are moments at which you have to go to war, but the bias ought to be, look, war is a last resort. Starting new ones is bad. It takes whatever you might be doing economically that would be productive for all of us, that would create a surplus with which we could do the stuff that great civilizations do, get squandered in stuff that blows up on a battlefield and is never seen again. It opens up routes for corruption. It obviously creates tremendous tragedy. So bias against war ought to be the default. But there are a whole bunch of people who aren't biased against war because they make money through war. And so in any case, a president who didn't start any new wars, when every other recent president has, would certainly be a problem for those whose business model depends on the fact that we always have a reason to start a new war, and if we don't have one, we'll make one, right? So one reason this guy might be targeted as an insurrectionist is not an antipathy to America, for which I don't see any evidence. Mm-hmm. I think this guy has a different priority, but hatred for America, no. I don't see any evidence of that. So there is a desire to make it impossible for this person to ascend to the office. There is at least one reason that people who are themselves being deeply unpatriotic might want to prevent that using any tool at their disposal, especially in light of the popularity of the man, especially at the moment. And the idea that you might then invoke this exotic prohibition against insurrectionists showing up on the ballot, right, it's a shocking departure from normalcy and decency and all of that. On the other hand, we are in a Cartesian crisis, and there are those who think that what I've just said, as much as what I've said seems to me perfectly obvious and utterly secure, there are those who think that the existential threat represented by this person, even though he was president for 4 years and we were not destroyed and not even nearly so, that is exactly the reason for which the ripcords that have been placed in various places have been placed. Now, even that I would say is preposterous. The fact is the Constitution does not have exceptions for epidemics or reality TV stars ascending to the presidency. It just doesn't happen for good reason, because if it did, then that would be the whole game, right? And in fact, the sense that people think that the exceptions exist is, it is now the game, creating the impression that the circumstances are such that we now have to pull these levers that largely don't exist. It is now where we are, and that requires the public to be dragged into irreconcilable narratives. The reality that I know, is completely incompatible even with the narrative that my parents see, mm-hmm. right? And, we get along. But there is, as soon as we get over into the territory that the New York Times covers every day, it's not possible to find common ground in which, yeah. So the destruction of a shared analysis, no, not analysis, a shared set of facts.
Right. That's exactly it. That's it again, right? Like we can't even get to the interpretation part.
Right.
We can't even get to the analysis part, the part where we get to use logic, the part where we get to reveal ourselves as descendants of the Enlightenment. No. If we can't even agree on facts, we are stuck there at the most fundamental level of, like, it's barely even human level, right? Like, there are a lot of organisms that should be able to do this that aren't human, and we can't even agree on this.
We are watching civilization decohere over a failure to agree on simple matters of fact and obvious extrapolations from them. And what I want to argue, so we've got Tim Kelly, who points out that Bayesian reasoning has a flaw, and I'm not certain that the flaw he's found is actually a flaw in Bayesian reasoning. It's a flaw in something about the way the mind applies this particular method. But I wanted to lay out an argument, and the argument is you've got different ways of doing an analysis. You've got what I would call an Aristotelian or Baconian scientific approach. Standard observation, hypothesis, prediction, test.
Thesis, synthesis, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Yep. You've got the Popperian version of this, in which falsification takes on its special capacity to protect us from reinforcing pre-existing notions. You've got Bayesian analysis, and then you've got other folks who are doing something entirely different. You've got folks who ascribe to a worldview in which there is some organizing principle with an intelligence to it. People who are devoted to a religious worldview, who don't necessarily, and I will come back to why this sounds wrong, but do not necessarily care what the output of all of these scientific or rigorous analytical processes say. It's not going to budge them off of some core belief about the most fundamental facts of the universe. So, the upshot of all of this, I think, is how does the mind work? Right? We are told, there's evidence that it works in a Bayesian way. And if it does, that explains why people are unwilling to depart from core beliefs that they hold very strongly. It's a mathematical issue, right? That the math does not cause, if you presented them with a small upgrade to their model, they might move just a little bit. If you present them a large upgrade, they abandon the upgrade as an outlier and they don't move at all, right? So that's a paradox. Presumably the larger departure from their worldview should move them farther, but in fact it moves them less, right? That sounds like, the math is bad in the brain. Why would a brain be built that way? Well, my argument's going to be, it ain't. In fact, what you have is a mind. First of all, realize from our perspective, the mind is built to solve evolutionary puzzles. What does it mean to solve an evolutionary puzzle? Well, it means that you make the most of the opportunity that you have in terms of getting your genes as far into the future as you can. That's what it means to solve it. Well, wait, I didn't hear you say anything about being right. Oh no, being right isn't involved. To the extent that the universe cares if you're right, it cares if you're effective at something. And in our case, it cares at the level of whether we get our genes into the future. Well, what if believing wrong things gets your genes into the future? Cool. Then that's what you're going to do. So, that is simultaneously living with a mind that is perfectly capable of doing science and doing it brilliantly, right? Now, a scientific worldview will have you accept things on the basis, I think in the upgraded form, that a falsification has caused you to abandon some primitive way of thinking in favor of a new way of thinking that may actually be bad for you, right? Science doesn't care whether the conclusion that you come to gets your genes into the future, but it is true that on average, knowing more will provide you opportunities to get your genes into the future in ways that you might miss if you knew less. So there's some conflict. Is selection really just getting you to believe whatever is useful, even if it's wrong? Is it trying to get you to figure out what's right? It's doing both. But it's doing those in a way that presumably does not have you obligated to one or the other.